since the criminalization of sex workers had ramped up so much over the last few years, um, the politicians had only heard about us from the police. It didn't even occur to them that we could speak for ourselves
Yeah.
or had anything to say. So they were shocked to find out that we could not report sex trafficking without being arrested for prostitution. And to find
Wow.
out that when the police told them that they are like rescuing us from sex trafficking, that they're actually having sex with us and then arresting us.
Welcome to the Fearless Living Podcast.
Welcome to the Fearless Living Podcast. I'm Annie Temple, your host, and today we are interviewing someone that I have been following for probably 2 decades and have so much admiration for this woman. I'm excited. Her name is Tara Burns. She is an Alaskan sex worker and a sex trafficking survivor living off-grid and remote. She is the research and policy director of COYOTE, Rhode Island, a founding board member of Community United for Safety and Protection, a former co-chair of the International Steering Committee for the Red Umbrella Fund, and she has done groundbreaking academic research and lobbying for sex workers and sex trafficking survivors. She is also the author of the Whore Diaries series, and her writing about sex work policy issues has appeared in publications like the Anti-Trafficking Review, Vice, AlterNet, and the Anchorage Press. And sex worker leaders have long observed the relationship between anti-trafficking legislation and anti-sex work policy. Now, a new book out from the USA brings together the findings of 6 separate participatory action research projects to explain and unpack what the conflation of trafficking and sex work looks like in practice. Alaska's anti-trafficking laws criminalize most sex work activity, making this jurisdiction a perfect case study for researching the strengths and weaknesses of policy that conflate the two. Rhode Island is another case study, important because anti-trafficking campaigners successfully oversaw new laws to criminalize sex work in 2009 after 6 years of accidental decriminalization. Surveys before and after the bipartisan FOSTA-SESTA anti-trafficking and anti-exploitation legislation are also examined in the book, as well as a survey conducted at the height of COVID-19 and a nationwide study that is the largest survey ever done of U.S. sex workers and sex trafficking survivors. And that's what we're mostly going to talk about today with Tara. So welcome to my podcast, Tara. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been following you for at least a couple decades too, and I think this is the first time we've ever spoken. And I just got done listening to your book too, so this is very exciting.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for listening to my book. That's awesome. So before we get into our discussion, can you just, in your own words, explain to the listeners who you are?
Yeah, I'm just an old stripper. That I do full service sex work now. I have been doing a lot of research and lobbying for people in the sex industry for the last 10 years or so now. We did some really exciting stuff in Alaska where we used some of the research in this book to change our sex trafficking law and make it a little less bad, and also to create the first immunity and reporting law. And then for the last few years, I've been very fortunate to work with COYOTE Rhode Island and just be supported in doing really amazing participatory action research with sex workers all over the US.
Wow, that
And
sounds so amazing. Sorry.
oh no, it's blurry. Okay,
There it
yeah,
is.
this is the new book, A Sex Work Policy. Um, and yeah, it's super exciting.
Mine.
I look back on, yes, I look back like I remember when I was still kind of a baby sex worker, which at the time I thought I was like, had been in the industry for so long, had been stripping for like 10 years. But in retrospect, I was a baby sex worker, and I remember um, the being on the stripper web forum, which you remember, right?
Hmm.
And I remember somebody posted this research. It was like a news article, and it was like new research, all strippers are victims of domestic violence. And somebody posted this and was like, "Is it true? Are we?" And we were like, "Well, like I'm not, but maybe I'm rare." And um,
Hmm.
and I was so confused. And then somebody came along after a couple days of conversation and said, "You have to read the methodology section." That was like a piece of research that was done by somebody who was doing like their internship at a woman's shelter, at a domestic violence shelter. And she had like 8 strippers came through, and she interviewed them, and they were all victims of domestic violence. And that doesn't mean, you know, so in doing all of this research with people and putting this book together, I really thought a lot about how research really shapes the way that we understand ourselves, not just the way that people outside of our community understand us.
Hmm.
But, we look to these books and these like official research things, and they also tell us about ourselves. So for me, that was a really important part of doing this research, is that, our understanding of ourselves is coming from each other and not from, you know, police or people who make a living off of our criminalization by having us
Hmm.
forced into their services and stuff like that.
Or even researchers that research us but don't ask us for our input. And so when they analyze their results, they're really, it's faulty because they are coming from the wrong perspective. Or often they just don't know what it's actually like in the industry, so they make assumptions and that skews their data.
Yeah. I mean, so much of the data is just like capitalism sucks and having to work for money sucks, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. And I like how you pointed out how the study that said that all strippers are victims of domestic violence was actually a study that was done on all people who were victims of domestic violence who also happen to be strippers. And
Mhm.
that's similar to the research that says most women enter sex work at the age of 14 or something, 13 or 14. I believe that that study was done on all underage youth.
Yeah. So even crazier than that, I think that was a study of underage people who had traded sex in, I want to say Australia or New Zealand. But the finding actually was that that was the first age at which they had had any kind of like sexual contact with a boyfriend,
Wow.
not sex work. And that's been so thoroughly debunked now. Even the Polaris Project has stopped spreading that lie. It's been called out in the Washington Post a couple times, but we actually this year in Alaska had a politician um, get up and present that as the truth in front of our legislature.
That's
So
so
yeah, it's
crazy.
crazy the long-term impacts of those kinds of unethical
Yes.
research.
Oh, 100%. And I believe I've like the research that I've looked at that's interviewed adult consensual sex workers, the majority were like in their 20s, 30s, even 40s when they first started. Like
Mhm.
they're like I was 23 when I started stripping, and I didn't start doing intimacy work until I was 40 something. I think
Yeah.
44. So
I mean, I started when I was really young, and I know many other people who also did.
Mm.
But I think it's just like any other kind of work. People get into it at different ages.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a whole other conversation too, the whole youth aspect of uh do we just erase their voices by saying they're sexually exploited, or do we listen to them and find out how they came to this place in their lives of providing sexual services as underage people? Because often their story is that what they're doing is actually less harmful from what they would be doing if they weren't doing sex work, which is, I don't know if I said that correctly, but
Oh
so
yeah,
that's always an interesting thing too.
yeah, I absolutely had a way better experience in the sex industry than in foster care as a minor
Yes.
personally. Um, yeah, that is an area of research that I'm hopefully have a few projects in the works um, that will be coming up in the next few years to boost some of
Cool.
those voices of youth who are involved in the sex industry. Everything in this book, people who took the surveys all had to be over 18. But we did have in the 4 years of FOSTA survey some really interesting findings about some things that were different for people who had entered the industry as minors, that they were experiencing higher rates of like discrimination and being turned away from shelters.
Yeah.
Um,
So I got into that research. Before we start talking about it, can you explain SOSTA FESTA or a little bit for the listeners who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, so FOSTA SESTA it was this big law that passed back in 2018, I believe, in the US. And it's supposed to, save the children from sex trafficking. A lot of people think that was what took down Backpage. Backpage actually came down a week or two before FOSTA SESTA passed. But basically, um, it was a law that brought down all of our advertising websites, many of our screening websites. And, it didn't just affect US sex workers because it brought down all these websites that were based in the US that sex workers in other countries used. I know at the time that FOSTA SESTA passed, I was on an international board, and there were sex workers in Africa who lost their income overnight because of FOSTA SESTA bringing down the websites, and they, had to go out and work in more dangerous conditions. Um, there were sex workers that I knew in Alaska who, were living kind of hand to mouth out of hotels and ended up, on the street and sleeping outside in tents in the winter right after FOSTA SESTA passed. It was just horrible. But to listen to the anti-trafficking people talk, they can't see us anymore. We're not all over the internet, so uh, they feel like they've succeeded.
So, I mean, there's so much to unpack there because getting into that chapter, I mean, the themes are obvious. The sex working in the sex industry became more dangerous, not just for adult consensual sex workers, but especially for more vulnerable sex workers and people who do identify as being exploited in the sex industry. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So we ask people, there's every state in the US has its own definition of sex trafficking, and those definitions can get pretty wonky, but we have a federal definition that is, people who entered the industry as minors or people who've been victims of force, fraud, or coercion within the industry. And so whenever I run any kind of survey of sex workers, I just ask, did you enter the industry as a minor and have you been a victim of force, fraud, or coercion within the industry? And then I found that when you sort for those answers, right, those people who would be federally defined as sex trafficking victims, even though they often usually would not call themselves sex trafficking victims, right? Because we all think like you've seen the posters of like women huddled up in the back of a semi truck, right? So
Mhm.
somebody who has just, had a bad boyfriend while they were doing sex work or,
Or a bad
worked for an
client, one
agent.
bad client.
Yeah, or like worked for an agency that, like
Mm.
lied to them and took some of their money. Those people don't necessarily identify themselves as sex trafficking victims. And it's perceived as a really disempowering role to be in, right? Because there's
That's
this
so
idea that it
interesting,
means that
because
you,
when people are exploited in regular square jobs, which I've had a lot of square jobs too, and I
Mhm.
always felt more exploited in those jobs personally. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in our industry. And I have been exploited as a stripper more than as an independent sex worker, because
Yeah.
you have to deal with agents and club owners and DJs and
Mhm.
but where was I going with this? It's like, if we just say that we've experienced coercion or fraud or force of some kind, then we automatically fit into that uh, definition, which is kind of crazy because people in regular jobs experience those things, and we don't put them into a category of being trafficked.
US federal law, actually, if people have been victims of force, fraud, or coercion, and by somebody who is, like in that employer role, profiting from their labor, that is labor trafficking, which a lot of people, don't understand. And I think, remember back 30 years ago, we thought that rape was like something that couldn't happen. It was all about like stranger danger and somebody's going to kidnap you in a van, and
Mhm.
that's what rape is, and date rape wasn't a thing. And so we have this idea, right, that trafficking is being forced into some kind of work, and that's absolutely not the definition of trafficking at all. So I think we're kind of going through that process of learning to talk about it like as labor exploitation rather than like as some dramatic thing that just happens if you're like kidnapped and forced into the sex industry, which we know like very rarely happens, right?
Yeah. And when it does, there are so many laws to deal with it.
Yeah. Although, you know, I, I I think things are different there in Canada. Actually, I
Mhm.
was in Canada one time and we had um I went to Canada. I was actually sex trafficked to Canada. My friend called me up and she was like, "Holy shit, I'm in Canada and it's this holiday here, the Chinese New Year, and I'm making $2,000 a day. You got to get here, right?"
Wow.
And she was working with this agency that they only took 10%. And so I talked to them and I was like, "Cool." And I went to Toronto and I was so excited. And they picked me up from the airport and they were like, "Yeah, now we have girls coming from other countries to work for us. So actually, now our cut is going to be 50%." And I was like, "You used fraud to get me to travel across international lines for the purpose of prostitution. Oh my God, it's sex trafficking."
It is.
Um, and I did not make that much money, but I had a good time. And while I was there, it was kind of this, almost like a collective of women who, went in together for an ad for a phone number. And while I was there, there was a woman who had left the kind of collective and gone back to her boyfriend, and she was like, "Fuck you, peace out." And then she called from like a client's phone and said her boyfriend was taking all of her money and keeping her high, and she wanted us to come and
Wow.
get her. And the other women were like, "Oh, we're going to call the police. We have a card of a friendly police officer who. The hotel that they stayed at had like introduced them to this officer, and the officer was like, "Oh, here's my card." And
Wow.
they're like, "Yeah, we're gonna call Officer Bob or whoever it was." And I was like, "Oh my God, I'm gonna get deported from Canada," you know. Um, but that officer actually, went and got her out of that bad situation, asked her if she
Wow.
wanted services, put her back in the car with the other woman, and told her, if you're going to do this kind of work, you should work with other women and be safe. Here in the
I just got
U.S.,
goosebumps. Sorry. That is a beautiful story. I love it when you hear
no,
of a kind police officer doing something. Wow. Because you
right?
hear the other stories a lot more.
Yeah, here in the US, if you try to go to the police and report that you're being sex trafficked, it's very likely that you'll be arrested for prostitution, and that can affect the rest of your life. You will have a very hard time renting a place to live or getting a job outside of the sex industry.
Wow.
So it's kind of mind-blowing to say, but it's easier to leave a sex trafficker, move across the country and move on with your life than it is to move on with your life after a prostitution charge where, they might be stuck on parole, so stuck in that state for a year or two, in proximity to their trafficker,
Do you
and
think
not be able
anyone
to
ever
leave the
says
sex
they're
industry.
trafficked because of that instead of like claims that they're trafficked even though they weren't, just so that they get treated better? Just
Um,
curious.
I mean, I know a lot of people do, and there's a lot of um, a lot of service providers encourage that and say, well, you were trafficking yourself. You were in the sex trafficking industry. You're a victim of the sex trafficking industry,
Hmm.
right? So there's not really a requirement even that people say that they were victimized by another person in
Hmm.
particular. Um, but even if they are a trafficking victim in most states and in Alaska until a few years ago, you could go to the police and report to them that you're a trafficking victim or report to them that you've been sexually assaulted, and they're very likely to arrest you for prostitution
Wow.
instead of arresting the bad guy. And so, that's a reason that we don't have people going to police for help when they're
No
trafficked.
doubt. Wow, that's insane. It's insane that people who are doing something that doesn't hurt anyone are being
Mhm.
criminalized in a situation where someone is hurting them. That is messed
Right.
up. That is so messed up.
Yeah, I mean, and it still happens, even in Alaska with our immunity law. We had a case just a couple of years ago where a young lady who had been trafficked since she was 16, I think, was calling the police repeatedly, asking for help, saying that her trafficker was going to shoot her, kill her. Um, and then he did shoot her. He shot her 3 times and left her for dead. She was pregnant with his baby. And just about a week later, they arrested her for conspiracy to sex traffic,
Oh my,
right? Because it had been her apartment that prostitution was happening out of. And so, I mean, she's a registered sex offender now. She has a very hard time
ugh. That reminds me of a woman
doing
when I was
anything.
working in transition houses, who had, there was a violent John going around, and I can't remember. It's been so long now. It was like 25 years ago I heard the story maybe. But he was definitely attacking sex workers, street-based sex workers. I'm not sure if he killed any of them, but she felt like he was going to kill her. She managed to get his knife away from him, and she killed
Mhm.
him. And she went to jail for it.
Oh
I thought
yeah.
that was mind-blowing. Why do you go to jail for defending yourself? In Canada, you're actually not legally allowed to defend yourself. Isn't that crazy?
Oh yeah. I mean, that kind of thing happens all the time. I think that a lot of people would be shocked if they saw what really goes on in our criminal justice systems.
Mhm. Especially to women.
Yeah.
I mean, and men too. Like lots of shit happens to men too. I don't want to dismiss that, but like to think, like for instance, I'd have a girlfriend who is a sex worker who was sexually assaulted in the course of her work, and one of the bravest people I've ever known. She reported it to the police, went through the entire process of getting a lawyer, going through court. Her mother was with her every step of the way, which is beautiful. And she was re-traumatized, and it went on for like I think a year or maybe even 2 years, and then they
Mhm.
dropped it because there wasn't enough evidence against him. It's just,
Mhm.
but fortunately for her, she did have a good experience with the police in that situation. And I think it with the police, it does depend on the individual and also the department.
Yeah,
So,
for
for
sure.
instance, like our Vancouver Police Department, because of the missing and murdered women in Vancouver not many years ago, it feels like yesterday, honestly, uh, they were forced to have conversations with sex workers after that
Mhm.
because they failed so miserably in protecting sex workers. So there's been a relationship built there, and they've been educated, and they can continually go through education on sex work, and they're not all good at good at it. Not all of them really learn or get it, but the ones that
Mhm.
do and the ones that work directly with sex workers are mostly quite good from what I've heard with of people who've had to interact with them as sex workers. I think that for me, I would be really, I feel like if I had to call the police, I would only do it if I honestly feared for my life. Uh, and that would be the only way because I wouldn't want my workspace to be heated out. And
Yeah,
they would know now where I work, what I'm doing, and that would make me feel unsafe for my clients because we have the Nordic model out here, or
right.
the Swedish model or whatever.
Mhm.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So what we found in the 4 years of FOSTA survey was that it really increased or decreased the willingness of sex workers to call the police if they were victims of a crime.
Hmm.
Um, 50% said that they were less likely to go to the police now if a client brought child porn, and 70% said that they were less likely after FOSTA to go to the police if they were assaulted.
Wow. Yeah. And so do the people who brought FOSTA SESTA into existence, do they do any research to see whether it's effective in the way that they wanted it to be, or do they listen to you when you try to present that information to them?
No, they do not. So there was a court case to overturn FOSTA SESTA, um, brought by the Woodhull Freedom Foundation and the Freedom of Speech Coalition, I believe. And so at Coyote, we found out a, a lawyer from the National Council for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and girls, who's been a great ally to Coyote. Their attorney said, "Hey, did you know that in the initial filings in the amicus brief, um, like they quoted the survey, the data from the survey that Coyote did right after FOSTA extensively." And she was like, "You guys should file an amicus brief for the upcoming court date." And she was like, "Could you do a new research study to update the data 4 years later? And you
Wow.
got 6 weeks to do it." And we were like, "Sure."
No
Yeah,
doubt. No doubt.
yeah. So it
That's a
was,
huge undertaking in 6 weeks, though. Wow.
yeah. And we actually got well over 200 people that took the survey. Bella is amazing and just, tirelessly was emailing the survey out and tweeting it. And um, we got a really good amount of data.
It's awesome. Yeah. Bella's another person I admire and follow.
Mhm.
Bella Robinson.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is so awesome. So now I I know that this is like a something that you've been like talking about on other podcasts, and this is a thing now you're talking about this research in this book. What are your next steps with this research? Like where will you take it now, and how can you use it to, like, do you have like guerrilla tactics in mind of how to get this information in front of the people who can make a difference?
Yeah, we need people like you, Annie, to help get the word out to activists and policymakers, particularly in the United States. There's been a lot of interest from academics in other countries. And that's great, I mean, it feels great that academics like our work. But, we're really trying to, the point of doing all of this work and all of this research and all of this writing, was to benefit the people who took the surveys, who participated in the research,
Mhm.
and to get their voices out there to the people who are making the policies affecting them.
Yes.
So, yeah, we really need people to, read the book and spread the information and give
And
a
not
copy
not
to
to
your
get too
legislator.
yeah, not to get too political, but I think it was during Trump's term that FOSTA SESTA came into,
Yes.
right? Is that correct? Yeah. But I also have read that Kamala was very strongly
She was
pushing
the
it?
sponsor. Yeah, she sponsored it.
Really?
She's
So
been
that's interesting.
very, yeah, she's been very anti-sex worker. And I don't know if do you remember the Celeste Guap case?
I don't know.
So there was this situation that happened in Oakland that came to light because the Oakland Police Department was under supervision of the courts, where like dozens of police officers, and not just from Oakland PD, but also some neighboring police departments, had had sex with an underage sex worker. Um,
All
named
the
Celeste.
same sex worker?
Yeah, so
Wow. I
her
did
public
not
name
hear
is,
about this.
yeah. So this happened like in 2017, 2018.
Okay.
And she initially, her mom worked for the Oakland Police as a 911 operator. So she initially met an Oakland police officer when she was like running for her life from a pimp, and she jumped in his car, and he was like, well, do you want your mom to find out about this? There's another way we can handle it. Um, and then the next thing you know, she was just being passed around between all these police officers. And one of them killed himself and left a confession, which was swept under the rug. Um, and then the Oakland Police Department completely mishandled that investigation. But at that time, Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of California, and she declined to press significant charges against any of those officers or to really do anything, right? So she just over and over and over, when it was on the ballot to decriminalize prostitution in California, she opposed it. Um, she has at every opportunity worked to make our lives more dangerous and precarious and increase violence against us.
Wow. So, but Trump is not any better. Was he also in favor of FOSTA SESTA? Because now he's the new president, I believe,
Yeah, I
right?
think he's much more likely to like put us in internment camps.
Mm. So there's no
But
way of getting like his support to get decriminalization.
you would think, and I remember um because his wife was a sex worker, and I remember tweeting at her and being like, "Hey, you talk to your husband, tell him don't sign this."
Yeah, no doubt. Huh.
But yeah, no. I think that Trump and um like the QAnon conspiracy theorists have really benefited from
Oh,
using the
yes,
moral panics around sex trafficking and,
I agree.
these ideas that the Democrats are sex trafficking children, or Hillary Clinton was supposed to be sex trafficking children through a pizza shop, and that kind of thing. Um,
Pizzagate. I heard about that.
Pizzagate, yes, and then the Wayfair thing, where they thought
Mhm.
that, yeah. So they've on the one hand, I love it because it shows how crazy these moral panics are. But on the other hand, they've really benefited from it, and they'll probably continue to do it.
Mhm. That's really unfortunate. We're kind of in a similar situation. We're coming up on an election. It could happen sooner than expected, but it's expected in 2025. Uh, but I think like watching our political landscape, the conservatives are getting the most like support across Canada right now. And there's a very, very strong chance we're going to have a conservative government. And they were the government that brought in our current laws around sex work. And
Mhm.
I've already started trying to reach out to the guy in charge, Pierre Poilievre or whatever his name is, trying to contact him to just have a conversation about sex workers, because I'm like, why don't we try to talk to him before he's really super busy as the prime minister? But I get no response at all.
Yeah.
It's very disappointing. It reminds me of during COVID when I was really concerned about masking my child and I was being ignored by the schools and by anyone that I was completely ignored, erased, silenced. I didn't exist, and that's
Mhm.
how I feel as a sex worker when I try to reach out to the right, the conservatives. And it's sad because I know conservative sex workers. They do exist. Uh,
Yeah.
they lean mostly conservative, obviously not on the sex worker issue. But I mean, I think the majority of us have a few issues we lean the other way on, no matter who we are.
And
But
so many of these issues flip-flop between parties, right? Like
yeah, that
the
too.
anti-censorship used to be the left, and now the right is claiming it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I know exactly. That's so true. And that it's like they just switch off and they just keep us thinking that we have some kind of power over our lives. Like when we had the laws taken down in Canada with the Bedford case, the previous laws were all taken down. We were decriminalized, and then the conservatives ushered in very quickly new laws that were just as bad, if not worse. And so
Mhm.
at that time for me, that was so demoralizing. And I felt like, what's the point? Because that had taken decades of work to create those relationships, build those arguments, get ourselves all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. I wasn't one of the people who was actively involved in those cases, but some of my dear friends were. And so it was just I was kind of a front row seat to it.
Mhm.
And so when the laws were taken down and then just immediately replaced, it feels like why even keep trying sometimes? So how do you keep going when you have so many things that like sometimes it feels like you're getting ahead and then all of a sudden things get worse, like FOSTA SESTA, you know? How do you keep going?
Well, I try to have realistic expectations, and I try to also, only do things that I think that I might have a chance of being effective at. So, like when we changed Alaska's sex trafficking law, that was something that I looked at it and I thought, yeah, this is realistically something that we can do, and I'm going to invest my time in it. And I did, and we did. Um,
Can you tell us a little more about that too?
yeah, so back in 2012, Alaska changed their sex trafficking law to make basically almost all prostitution became sex trafficking. And at the time, I thought that like we were collateral damage, that there were people out there who were actually being helped. Um, and I did a records request after that law had been in place for 2 years, and I found out that every single person who had been charged with sex trafficking at that time was a sex worker or a sex trafficking survivor who was charged with prostitution of themselves. In the same case, they were charged with sex trafficking. So, like for example, in one case, a woman was had gotten off work at a strip club and hadn't made her goal for the night. She put up an ad on Craigslist, and a cop responded, and she knew he was a cop, or she suspected he was a cop as soon as he showed up because they talk a certain way and they're like, will you suck my dick for this money? Because they're trying to get you to
Mm-hmm.
verbally incriminate yourself. And she kept telling him, no, I can't. Prostitution is illegal in Alaska. I'm only selling my time. You know, you're making me uncomfortable. If you're trying to buy sex, you need to leave. And they arrested her and charged her with sex trafficking for aiding and facilitating prostitution, right? So it was ridiculous enough that I thought we could change it. And I went to school and I got my master's degree. And I did this research that's in chapter 1 of the book, People in Alaska's Sex Industry, Their Lived Experiences and Policy Recommendations. And what was really shocking when I did that was that, there were a certain amount of people in the survey who did meet that federal definition of sex trafficking victims. And when I was creating the survey, I didn't even realize that you could like filter and look at different groups differently, right? So, I've got my results and I'm looking at it and trying to be like, oh, SurveyMonkey's so cool, right? And I realized, oh, I could filter for just people who've been victims of force, fraud, or coercion. And when I did that, I found they had been sexually assaulted by police officers almost 3 times as often as other sex workers. They were arrested when trying to report that they'd been the victim of a crime, about twice as often, or threatened with arrest or turned away about twice as often. And they were also discriminated against at shelters twice as often. So we took that research to, because it's action research, right? So the action part is that you have to take the voices of the people to the people who can do something about it. So I took that to Juneau for the legislative session, and politicians, had never met a sex worker before, many of them. Some of them, many of them also, I feel like Alaska is a little bit unique in the US in that prostitution was practiced openly here up until a few decades ago. So there are a lot of people who are, either politicians or work with politicians who, like they used to do the fire inspections of the brothels back in the day, or, they used to
It's
come
more
and unplug.
normalized.
Yeah, they used to come and fix the plumbing when people flushed too many condoms and that kind of
Yeah.
thing, right? So they know that we're people. But since the criminalization of sex workers had ramped up so much over the last few years, the politicians had only heard about us from the police. It didn't even occur to them that we could speak for ourselves or had anything to say. So they were shocked to find out that we could not report sex trafficking without being arrested for prostitution. And to find out that when the police told them that they are like rescuing us from sex trafficking, that they're actually having sex with us and then arresting us, or getting hand jobs and then arresting us. So just, I think because what the police were doing was so egregious, and because we got like this research data that, I did very correctly through an academic institution, we were able to get the trafficking law rolled back a little bit and say that you can't be charged with trafficking yourself anymore.
That is
Um,
amazing. Well done. I have to applause for you.
oh, thank you. So then that research, which is chapter 1 in the book, was replicated. And in this research, I did interviews as well as the survey. So like most of what you'll read in that first chapter are people's firsthand experiences of, trying to report crimes to the police, or being assaulted by the police, or, things um, that have that they've experienced in the industry. So then chapter 2 of the book is the research in Rhode Island. And then, we also have, right, the people in the industry's definitions of prostitution and sex trafficking. So then that research was replicated in Rhode Island at Brown University,
Wow.
which is chapter 2 of the book. And a lot of the data really lined up with the data from Alaska, which is great, right? That's called like validity, is another
Yes,
survey finding the
exactly.
same
That's a
thing.
validity. That's the whole
Yeah,
goal with research, is to get replicable results, because that's how you
right.
know that you're onto something and that you're actually getting real truths through your studies.
Hmm. Yeah. So one of the things that was different between them was that the rates of sexual assault by police officers was much higher in Alaska,
Wow.
which makes sense because Alaska has like the highest rates of sexual violence in the United States.
Wow.
Sadly, they call us the rape capital. So it does make sense that we would have higher rates of sexual assault by police officers. But, it's interesting to look at that. And then the US survey, which had thousands of sex workers, and included online workers and all kinds of workers. That data also in that survey, depending on if you filtered for in-person workers or all workers or workers who were victims, was a little bit different. But also that survey was done 3 years later And like these are things that are changing sometimes very rapidly, sometimes not at all, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah, one of the things I would love to do is just to go back and redo those surveys like every 10 years and see what has changed.
I mean, I'm just still blown away by how you accomplished your goal of having like changing the law. I was a part of having some bylaws changed around stripping back in like the 2000s.
Mhm.
Somewhere back there, the early 2000s, maybe mid, maybe late. I can't even remember. I'm getting old.
Yeah.
But yeah, and like it was just a matter of getting you in front of the right person who has the ability to influence decisions or make changes and and teach them, educate them, really. And so your
Mhm.
research educated, literally educated the people who had the power to make a difference uh, as to the harm that was coming from those laws in Alaska. That is so incredible and inspiring. And I just love that story. That's so amazing. Well, has anyone ever asked or studied, or do you have a working um, guess as to why sexual assault is a higher rate in Alaska than the rest of the US?
Um, you know, there's a lot of history there, and I think a lot
Mm,
of it, we can't separate any of these factors from each other. Part of it is the very recent and ongoing genocide of Alaska Native people.
mm,
Um, Part of it is that so many parts of the state are very remote. There's no police officers,
mm,
or what we have are called like village public safety officers who, there are many villages where there's one village public safety officer and they have themselves been convicted of sexual assault or domestic
mm,
violence in the
mm,
past. Um, there are jurisdictions. Nome was recently in the news. Nome is a place where there was a police officer who just, I think about 10 years ago, really brutally sexually assaulted and murdered a young Indigenous woman, and the police there helped to cover that up. And
oh,
then, police or the prosecutor and police there have had a practice of not prosecuting sexual assaults of Native women.
mm.
Um,
So this is
we
systemic racism,
It's
systemic
systemic. It's very systemic,
colonization.
right? So like we had the serial killer Robert Hansen back in the late 80s and early 90s, who was killing sex workers, and everybody knew who he was. He'd been reported to the Anchorage Police Department several times. And the Anchorage police refused to investigate him because he was a good business owner, right? And it actually took the Alaska State Troopers had to go to a district attorney in Fairbanks to get a search warrant and went and took him down after multiple women had reported him and multiple women had escaped from him. And those women, when they went to the police, were threatened with arrest, right? And so, we want to say that kind of thing is like ancient history, but then just in 2018, a woman, um, Alicia Youngblood, went to the Anchorage police and said that a man she'd been dating showed her videos of himself brutally killing sex workers. And
Mm,
they told her that he was just playing a role play game with her, a sexy bedroom role play game. She brought them to a place where he told her that he had dumped a body, and that is the place where eventually the body was found. But they didn't bother to find it then. She fled the state. And then a year later, it was a sex worker who stole his phone and brought the videos to the police. And she was so smart the way that she did it. She was worried about being charged with prostitution. Um, and she copied the videos to an SD card and so that she wouldn't be like in possession of his phone and be charged with theft either. And instead of, I feel like if she had just called the Anchorage Police Department and, gotten the homicide department, they would have done the same thing that they
Hmm.
had done when the previous woman reported it. But she brought the videos to her doctor's office and said, look, this is real, right? And her doctor called the police and they sent a patrol officer who was new, um, who, watched the videos and was just horrified. And then at that point, they couldn't really sweep it under the rug anymore, right? Um, and they went and arrested him for the two murders that were in the videos in the phone. But, when they arrested him, they found photos of a third woman that he seems to have murdered, and they did not bother to investigate. They didn't tell her family. Her family found
Wow.
out when the photos were included in like some court documents, and activists found them and reached out to her family. And this was 5 years after they'd found the photos on his phone.
Oh my God.
Um, so very much the violence here is enabled, if not facilitated, by the police. And
Wow.
it's a hard thing to try to change that kind of culture in a police department when it's been for, decades.
Maybe even
You would have to
centuries.
you would have to get rid of all of the police and like start over with all new police
Yeah,
almost. Yeah.
that's insane. Wow. That's just,
Yeah.
wow, that's heartbreaking.
And
But
then when Alicia found out about the two women that he'd killed, after she reported him to the police, she ended up committing suicide, which is just another tragedy, right?
mhm.
Um, so yeah, that's why we have so much violence in Alaska because, they know they're allowed to. And there are men, like that man who moved to Alaska because, there's so much even just in the news about how people are basically allowed to sexually assault and murder marginalized women here.
Wow.
That people who are looking for a place to do that will move here to do it.
Wow. Wow, that's insane. Well, I mean, I know that the reason why sex workers are targets of a lot of predators is because we're less likely our assaults and murders are less likely to be investigated and less likely to be taken seriously, and a lot of people just consider it, our fault for choosing the work that we choose, which is just
Mhm.
so crazy. Just blows my mind. Well, we're coming to the end now of the hour, but I let's end on a more happy note. Can you just explain a little bit about your life in
Yeah,
Alaska? Because I love following your interesting life on socials, and I just think it's amazing and fascinating.
yeah. So I live in the woods. I spent my early childhood in Alaska on remote subsistence trap lines where we would be dropped off by a bush plane in October and picked up in May and not really see any people in between. And just trap all winter. And then we would go to town and sell the furs and get some rice and beans and
Wow.
go fishing and then go back out. So I live now kind of semi-remotely. I can get out to the road system it doesn't take me days or anything to get to the road system, and then I can drive to town from where I am. Um, but people can't drive here. And I, until recently was the only person living on this side of the river for about 40 miles. Um, so yeah, I don't have like regular electricity. I have a very small amount of solar power in the winter. Um, and I hunt and trap and fish and
Wow.
tan hides and enjoy living in the woods.
And do you live there by yourself?
Not anymore,
No.
no.
I was gonna ask, the only reason is because I thought, wow, like how isolated, but you have lived by yourself out there. Did you feel
Yeah,
I do you ever feel isolated? Like, do you feel lonely or just curious?
I think that's the great thing about sex work. So I did live by myself for my first like 14 years or so out here.
Wow.
And I Activism, in a way, activism has made me really jaded, but I was really innocent as a sex worker, even after like 25 years in the industry. So
When you
I
were a
would,
hobo stripper?
yes, I was a hobo stripper and then I came here. So I would stay out here until I would get really lonely. And then I would go to town and work for, 3 or 4 days and be like very intensely like all up in my clients' souls and stuff. Um, until I would be like, man, I need to fuck away from humans.
Yeah.
That's enough of that now. And then I would come back out here, and I really enjoyed that dichotomy. And I don't have it as much now because I'm more involved in activism and community stuff and have somebody living with me as well. So I never get to be lonely anymore.
Yeah. And now we have like Zooms and all this stuff that we
Yes.
didn't used to have that, yeah, helps us connect with people, at least see each other's faces. I feel like that helps.
Yeah. I used to have so much time, and now I'm like, when would I have time to see people anyways? You
Yeah,
know?
I know that feeling. Well, I just love everything about you and what you're doing. And I love following you on socials. I love your interesting, fascinating life. And I'm so excited to know like some of the things I didn't actually realize. I'm sure this is just a small amount of the stuff that you've done, but I didn't even know all of the stuff that you shared today. So that was just so cool and inspiring. And it teaches people who want to make a difference in their communities at a political or legal level that there is a way to do it. And I mean, even if we just replicate your path to it. I mean, doing the studies and then creating the information packages and then showing up in
Mhm.
person somewhere and shocking people because sex workers are smart and we know a lot of shit. And we're the
Yeah.
experts on our lives.
So, something that somebody almost anywhere can do is, make a public records request and find out what's happening where you live. Find out, who is being charged with prostitution, who's being charged with promoting prostitution or pandering or sex trafficking, and just put together all of those charging documents. And if you come to the Coyote website, we have a report called like prostitution and prostitution related charges in Rhode Island 2000 to present, right? That summarizes all of that. And you might find out that what's actually happening might be a little bit different than what you expected.
Mm.
um, but it's when you bring that kind of information forward to the public, the media, the politicians, it's very hard for them to deny what's like right there in black and white in the government's own records. um
Mm.
yeah.
That's great advice. Thank you. That's awesome. Now I want to do that. I just moved to a smaller town from a bigger town, and now I'm in this small town, and I'm actually kind of scared if anyone finds out what I do because it's like a very religious area. Like, but I don't work here. That's the good thing. I work 45 minutes away. So
Yeah, me too. I've got a similar thing going on, and
yeah,
yeah, some people have seen me on TV and found out, and it's a little
it's a little
um
awkward, right?
yeah.
I know.
I mean, I feel like when I first moved here, I felt like, I could definitely probably get murdered if people found out, and I don't feel that way anymore, so that's good.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a little awkward.
You've become a part of the community now. That's probably why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, people know me. Some of them hate me, some of them love me.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah.
Well, I love you. I'm on the love side.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again. And I hope we can do this again because I've learned so much and I think you have a lot to share that's important for people to hear.
Yeah, I think after reading your book, there's so much we could talk about.
Ooh, we should just have like a girl chat uh, podcast interview next time.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Talk to you again soon. Oh, wait, before we do that, I need to know where can people find you? Where can people like learn more and reach out if they need to ask you a question?
Yeah, so people should come to the Coyote website. It's coyoteri.org. Um, and join the Coyotes email list to get, exciting updates like the book. And we have a couple other upcoming exciting things. So definitely join the email list, which is on Substack. It's a little bit hard to find from the website. Follow Coyote on Twitter and Facebook. And I am, man, Facebook has been really not nice to me lately, but Facebook is a good place to follow me. But I've started a Substack too, and it's taraburns.substack.com. And that is where you should follow me for updates about research or ramblings about my life in the woods. You can filter me on there. You can be subscribed to just sex work stuff or just the research stuff or just the off-grid living stuff if you want. And I'm hopefully going to be on there more after the beginning of the year.
Awesome. I love your Substack.
Yeah.
And
Are you on
Coyote.
Substack?
I love the name
Yes.
Coyote. A lot of people don't know what it means. I remember when I first found out what it meant, I was like, that is the coolest name ever. Coyote literally stands for call off your old tired ethics.
Mm-hmm.
I love
And
it.
Coyote was just has such an amazing history. They were the group that first sued the state of Rhode Island and actually decriminalized prostitution in the United States, like back in the 70s.
Wow.
Yeah, which was a really radical thing. And the original founder of Coyote, Margot St. James.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm
That's the correct
can't believe.
name. I didn't
Oh,
know
okay,
that she
yeah.
was the person who founded
Yeah,
Coyote.
she
Okay.
was so radical. And I've just recently been, like reading stuff from like Susie Bright and other people that mention how she was like living in Italy as an old retired person, like radicalizing the workers there and stuff. So it's
That's
got
amazing.
it's got a deep and amazing history.
Awesome. I love it. Maybe one day people will talk that way about me and the naked truth. Oh yeah, you should have known Annie.
I think they already do talk about you that way.
Ah, thank you. All right. Well, I'll let you go enjoy the rest of your wonderful existence and your life today in Alaska, in the middle of nowhere. Thanks
Uh,
again, Tara.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Bye. I'm Annie Temple, the erotic entrepreneur. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much.